Last night, Russia launched a direct missile strike on Poland, hitting so hard that people there woke up. In response, Poland only stated that the next 100 days will be decisive for this war. But the chances are 50-50, and everything depends on the United States of America, not on them. Although in NATO, the tone has finally changed a little bit. On the night of July 30th, during one of the largest combined attacks on Ukraine, there were more than 70 missiles and over 280 attack drones. A Russian Kh-101 cruise missile crossed the Polish border and fell in the Lublin voivodeship near the village of Tarnowa Kolonia, about 70 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. As you can understand, this is no longer just a case of accidentally flying in, it traveled 70 kilometers through Polish territory. This is the first such incident in a NATO country since September of last year, when Polish fighter jets actually shot down Russian drones that had entered the country's airspace. The significance of the event is also that it happened against the backdrop of what we discussed with you on this YouTube channel the day before. Russia is once again testing NATO's resolve, literally last week. For 3 nights in a row, drone attacks targeted Romania, and now a missile has struck Poland. In this episode, we'll break down what is known about the incident itself, how the parties reacted to it, and what scenarios experts are discussing for what happens next. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the episode, and don't forget to leave any comment under this video. So let's start with some brief facts about the attack on Ukraine itself. On the night of July 30, Ukraine's Air Force warned about several waves of ballistic and cruise missiles targeted at various regions of the country, including the far west, which is hundreds of kilometers from the front line. Explosions that night thundered in Kyiv, Dnipro, Kryvyi Rih, and were also heard in Lviv, which is a city just 70 kilometers from the Polish border, where missiles damaged 2 residential buildings and injured 6 people, and 1 person unfortunately was killed. According to Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs Andriy Sybiha, at least 8 people have been killed across Ukraine, including 6 members of 1 family in a private house in Kryvyi Rih. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, had warned in advance about the likelihood of a massive attack. We will talk in more detail about this barbaric attack on Ukraine in a separate episode. The incident with Poland happened precisely against this backdrop amid the massive attack on Ukraine, and according to the operational command of the Polish armed forces, at night, surveillance systems tracked at least 12 missiles over the western part of Ukraine, which could have posed a potential threat to Polish territory. F-16 fighter jets were scrambled, air defense systems were put on high alert, an air raid siren sounded in the Lublin voivodeship. And then the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, at an emergency government meeting made a statement, and here is his quote. "We were ready to shoot down the missile if it had continued its flight. All indications point to it being a Russian Kh-101 missile. But we want to be 100% sure about the type of missile and who launched it. Well, this is, of course, a circus. The missile entered Polish airspace. Fighter jets were scrambled, and the Poles just watched as this Russian missile flew 70 kilometers over Polish territory. And then it hit an open area. Well, obviously to scare the Poles, but not to cause major damage. And now the Prime Minister of this country says, listen, if this missile had flown even 1 kilometer further, then we definitely would have shot it down. But hey, what's the big deal? Some missile only flew 70 kilometers into the country and just hit an open area. But if it had gone just a little bit further, then our patience would have definitely run out, and then we definitely would have shot down that missile. But as it is, we didn't. And so the investigation has established that an unidentified object fell in a field on Polish territory, a crater and debris have been found, and the incident is being investigated. According to preliminary information, citing Donald Tusk and a statement from the head of Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sybiga, it can be said that it was a Russian Kh-101 cruise missile. There is no official technical confirmation of the type of missile at the time of this recording. Donald Tusk himself also stated this directly. It's important to note this for objectivity. A telling detail about Zelensky's movements the day before, because I think it's not a coincidence that they struck specifically in the Lublin voivodeship. On his way home from the United States, Zelensky stopped in the Polish city of Lublin, not far from the site where the missile later fell, to meet with Donald Tusk. And so the leaders discussed the results of Zelensky's visit to the US and the security of Poland, Ukraine, and all of Europe. The meeting took place on the eve of the incident, which in itself is of course not proof of a connection between the events, but it does set a temporal context. And it's not hard to assume that the Russians decided to intimidate the Poles, like you guys are actually quarreling among yourselves over there. Poles are attacking Ukrainians in Poland, so keep on quarreling. Why are you hosting Zelensky? Here's a missile strike for you so that you keep blaming the Ukrainians. Like, it's Ukraine's fault that the war continues, and now missiles are even flying over Polish territory. Now let's talk about why this isn't the first such incident and what's fundamentally new in this case. The list of past incidents with Russian strikes on Poland, you could actually sit down and write it out, and it goes like this. In November 2022, a Ukrainian S-300 air defense missile exploded in Przewodów, Poland, after going off course due to Russian electronic warfare. And 2 people died then. Let me note that right away. Russia is to blame for that incident, because if it weren't for its war against Ukraine, then the missile from the Ukrainian air defense S-300 wouldn't have even been launched. In 2022 and 2023, there were already incidents of Russian missiles falling on Polish territory. In May 2026, a Russian Geran drone crashed into a residential high-rise building in the Romanian city of Galați. In September 2025, more than 19 Shaheds flew from Belarus into Poland, and at that time, NATO fighter jets shot down several drones. They called Moscow's actions absolutely dangerous behavior, but still didn't hit Russia back in response. Each time, NATO's response was limited to statements of concern. And now the opinions of Ukrainian experts about the nature of the current incident differ a little. And for example, aviation expert Valery Romanenko placed the responsibility on the Polish air defense system. He said, since the missile was already in your territory, it was your responsibility to shoot it down. Quote, if the missile, probably a K-101, fell on Polish territory, then it was missed by the Polish air defense. What do we have to do with it? This is a response to the fact that some Poles have already managed to write on social media that Ukraine is to blame for the Russian missile entering their territory. Like, Pechiy, why didn't Ukraine shoot down the missile on its own territory, the one that was flying over Poland? Oh, and Romanenko emphasized that it's good the missile fell in a field and once again called on partners not to reduce military aid to Kiev and to make decisions faster regarding new air defense systems for Ukraine. But what I would like to say in this situation is that the Russian missile was quite accurate and was well guided. And the fact that it reached as far as the Lublin region and didn't fall earlier due to electronic warfare measures may indicate it was intentional. That is, this is a probing move by Moscow, intended once again to show that NATO's air defenses are not on combat alert. In other words, to once again show that NATO is vulnerable and to scare Europeans once again. What are officials saying now about the significance of this incident for future policy? Donald Tusk stated that today's incident with the Russian missile only strengthened his resolve to continue supporting Ukraine and emphasized, quote, Poland's security directly and unequivocally depends on the effective actions of the Ukrainian military, particularly in the air. This quote should be repeated to every Pole. He also reiterated his assessment of the military outlook given at the end of the article. Meeting with Zelensky, quote, the next 100 days could decide the outcome of this war, and right now the chances are 50-50. He went on to add that the outcome of the war could be influenced by US President Donald Trump, certain other figures, and American billionaire Elon Musk, hinting that, look, Starlink was turned off and the Russians were blinded. An official representative of Ukraine used the incident as an argument in favor of strengthening Ukraine's air defense. In particular, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Sybiha stated, this is yet another clear indication that strengthening Ukraine's air defense is now an urgent necessity and serves as a guarantee for the protection of the entire Euro-Atlantic community. This is a direct statement of Ukraine's position. The missile incident is not presented as a reason for a NATO military response, but rather as an argument in favor of supplying Ukraine with anti-ballistic systems. Well, to be honest, a NATO military response against Russia wouldn't give us anything right now except for the war spreading to a wider area. Now, to the question of whether NATO will respond to Russia with some kind of strike. Well, at the moment there haven't even been any direct statements about invoking Article 4, let alone Article 5 of the NATO Charter, from the alliance or Poland in connection with this incident. So NATO isn't even considering it anymore. They don't even want to consult about this, let alone invoke Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. No, they're not even applying Article 4 about consultations. Warsaw's initial reaction once again appears restrained. And here I didn't just mention the current conflict between the Poles and Ukrainians for no reason. Russians can take advantage of this conflict. Such incidents, on the contrary, can fuel sentiment in certain Polish political circles. In the spirit of support for Ukraine has already led to the point that they say we need to stop it so that we don't get bombed. You see, some marginal political circles in Poland are already starting to spread the narrative that, look, the missile hit Poland precisely because we are helping Ukraine. If we stop helping Ukraine, then Russia won't attack Poland. And Russia might be counting on this and playing on it. As for who benefits from this and who doesn't, for the Ukrainian side, this incident is, to be honest, an additional concrete argument in negotiations with Western partners about the supply of air defense systems and anti-ballistic missiles. That is the topic that Zelensky raised during his visit to the US a few days earlier. For Poland, the situation is doubly uncomfortable. On the one hand, they need to demonstrate resolve in the face of a violation of a NATO country's sovereign territory. On the other hand, they need to avoid escalation, which could be used by domestic political forces that are skeptical about further support for Ukraine. For Russia, if the version about the intentional nature of the missile incursion is correct, this is a way to test NATO's response threshold without formally declaring a direct attack on the alliance's territory. Since the fall of a single missile, especially in an uninhabited area, does not provide sufficient grounds for consensus within the bloc under Article 5, that's why I assume that Russia launched this missile absolutely intentionally, understanding that NATO is unlikely to start attacking Russia in response, but at the same time, it clearly shows that there is no unity within NATO. It seems to me this incident will again remain within the framework of a diplomatic protest and demands for an investigation, as has happened in previous similar cases, without changing the format of NATO's military involvement. At the same time, this episode will become an additional argument for speeding up the delivery of air defense systems to Ukraine, which Ukrainian officials and even some Polish experts are already calling for. Here are some reasonable Polish experts who understand what is happening. But if the technical examination shows that the attack on the Polish border area was intentional, this may require the alliance to slightly adjust its internal calculations regarding the threshold for response. Summary: on the night of July 30th, during a massive attack on Ukraine with more than 70 missiles and nearly 300 drones, unfortunately, at least 8 people were killed. A Russian Kh-101 missile crossed the border and fell on Polish territory, just 70 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Poland scrambled fighter jets at 16. Put its air defense on alert, but for some reason they didn't decide to shoot down the missile itself. Officials from Poland and Ukraine used the incident to once again call for increased military support for Kyiv and not for escalatory rhetoric regarding a direct NATO military response. And that's all for now. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions about this story in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. I'd appreciate your support for this YouTube channel. You can do this by making any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.